Well, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us. I think we have some regulars who've been to a few of these with us before. Hopefully some regulars also watching the stream version. We're excited to have Greg with us as well. For anyone who's not familiar with how we do these, we tend to sort of have the first 25, 30 minutes sort of streamed, where Izzy will kind of throw us a few softball questions.
And a few hardball, maybe. Watch out. No peeking.
And then for the rest, we'll switch off the live stream and just focus on the audience in the room. But yeah, with that, maybe Izzy?
Yes. So hello, everyone. Izzy, and I'm going to be hosting today's discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about creating, actually one of my favorite topics, but creating a compelling vision and narrative that excites customers, investors, and talent in your business. So we're joined by Greg Jackson, the amazing Greg, who's CEO of Octopus, and of course, Stephanie Mead, CEO of Altruistic, who are going to share some of their experience and learnings on this topic. So as Steph said, a bit of housekeeping, first 30 minutes live, and then chatting house rules. So please keep any questions ready, because we would love to hear them. So Greg, maybe to pick on you first, how do you build and use mission to unite different stakeholder groups? So the team, investors, customers.
I think the question is what comes first, actually. Are you building something and using a mission to unite it? Or are you actually on a mission? I think there's an incredible book by a guy called John Kay, a professor at London Business School, called Obliquity. Says how our goals are best achieved indirectly. And what he really says is that time and again, you'll have companies that have been founded to do something bigger than just delivering on, for example, shareholder returns. And those companies have often done far better. And in fact, there were great case studies where they pivoted. ICI, which when I was young, was like the unbeatable British giant Imperial Chemical Industries. It was everywhere. And its mission was to create a science that would change the world for the better. And then in the 1980s, it decided to deliver the top 30% of shareholder returns. And within a decade, it was gone. And it was gone because the world... The economy and markets are changing all the time. So if you're chasing short-term profits and you spot that this year something's really profitable and your entire business is chasing those short-term trends, then you'll never catch them. But you're not investing in the stuff that doesn't change. That's the fundamentals. And I think by investing in fundamentals, it doesn't really matter what goes on in the short term. You'll never be the most profitable company, but actually, you'll be creating something that's solid and got resilience. And I've seen this quite a lot in my career. And I guess, so for example, when we started Octopus, I cared enormously about the environment. I joined Greenpeace when I was 15. It really matters to me. I also care about social justice, energy needs to be affordable. Everyone has to use it. Like if you're selling expensive watches, it's totally cool to charge 20 grand for something that costs 100 quid to make. I don't care. But if you're saying something everyone's got to use, then I think it's important that you work incredibly hard to make it affordable. And so for us, for example, we had a mission from the beginning. There was a fundamental one. It's not going to change. At least it is likely that everywhere in the world, in poor countries and rich countries, and in good times and in bad, low-cost energy is important to people. And it's unequivocally the case that energy is the single greatest contributor to climate change. And that therefore, until we sort out the cleanliness of energy, that's a fundamental. And so by building a business against two fundamentals, we can be pretty sure that if we're good at that, we will create value. Rather than setting out to create value and then saying, now what mission can we wrap around this? And so, I think the fundamental thing is being brave enough. And I don't mean we're brave. It was easy as a startup. I think it's really hard in existing businesses. But I'm brave enough to not just put a wrapper on something, but to make it your fundamental driver.
And for those businesses that perhaps didn't start off with a mission, what advice would you give to them to make that wrapper more concrete?
Yeah, I mean, I think all businesses start off with something. For example, we started off with an idea. We had no money, right? So we went and raised some money. And then we had an idea and we had some money, not that much. But we didn't have many customers and we didn't have a big team. So if you like, we had a couple of things on the scorecard that were extremely positive, but a couple that were really quite difficult. Meanwhile, our rivals, large energy companies, for example, started with a lot of people, a big balance sheet, a great brand. But for example, they might have a legacy mission or a lot of their assets might be in things that, for example, are about dirty energy. So in both cases, you've got some stuff that's helpful and some stuff that's hard. If you're starting with a brand, you've got maybe a great public affairs team, you've got a balance sheet. Well, I think, it may not be easy to change, but you can fundamentally change. We've seen it. There's a company called Ørsted, which they're currently having a tough time. It's the world's biggest, I think the world's biggest offshore wind company. But their tough times temporary. There've been some inflation issues, as we all know, and high interest rates caused by fossil fuels that have made it hard to build offshore wind farms for a short time. In a year or two, it'll all be fine, right? But Ørsted used to be called Dong, which, apart from sounding like an IKEA range, stood for Danish oil and natural gas. And they literally sold off all of their oil and natural gas and focused on renewables. And for a very long time, we're a global powerhouse and actually fundamentally are still incredibly valuable. So, these tough challenges are totally deliverable. And I should say, by the way, at the same time, that didn't demonize, they sold off their oil and natural gas. So somewhere, and I don't know what it's called, there'll be something that is the remnant, the rump of what they did. And, look, we all use oil, almost all of us in some way use oil and natural gas quite a lot. In fact, Octopus, clean energy company, I think we're the second biggest seller of gas in the UK, right? We're a phenomenal emitter, right? I can talk about what we think about that in a second, but I'd rather be honest about it than pretend otherwise. Those rump companies that are running in oil and gas, at least they're clear, and if you speak to some of them, they'll say, look, for as long as the world needs oil and gas, we're digging it out of the ground. But they're not pretending that they're trying to drive in the transition. And I think that's really helpful. So I'd much rather have honesty for companies that are firmly driving, for example, a sustainable world. And by the way, ones that come from a non-sustainable world. And so in a way, you take tobacco companies, which, for a long time, they literally claimed that tobacco didn't kill people. And then they said, well, it does, but we're creating safe tobacco with filters and low tar. It's all bollocks, right? Forgive me if this is streamed. If there's any lawyers, it may not be. When I say bollocks, I mean, it's I think largely not true. But and then bit by bit, they said, look, tobacco does kill people, but at least for some people, fags are fun, right? And at least you could then have the honesty that they can sell their product complete with all the warnings and everything else until society decides enough's enough. But at least that's more honest. And as a result, tobacco has delivered better returns over the last 30 years than almost any other sector. And yet nobody's pretending tobacco is not bad for you. And I think if we can have the same conversation in sustainability, which is meat is bad for the environment, right? That's cool. I eat meat, all right? I totally recognize that on my personal balance sheet, that's a bad thing. But I haven't given it up until we have better alternatives. And I know there'll be vegetarians in the room that tell me that, I'm being, but the point really being just honesty is more important than anything. And I think that's honesty, by the way, if you're being sustainable, and honesty if you're not. And what's really challenging is when you have companies that choose, it is easier to cheat or to deceive than it is to change.
So prioritize your genuine points and be honest about the bits that don't quite fit in line.
If you're not here for a mission that, for example, about sustainability, if you are, I use tobacco as an example just because there's no way anyone can pretend it doesn't do a load of bad stuff. But by not pretending, they deliver phenomenal returns for shareholders. Honestly, that's a good thing, all right? And I just think for a lot of companies, it will be choosing where they're going to go, making tough decisions, but you can deliver astonishing returns by just not pretending anymore, which is better for the planet because we at least all know what to think about you, right? And that's really powerful, or choosing to make positive change.
Yeah. So honesty's over here. Seth, I want to talk to you about consistency.
I like the contrast with honesty. Honesty's over here and on this side.
yeah. The naughty corner. How important, well, learning from your experience at Altruistic, how important is consistency as a factor in building a mission?
Yeah, so I'm slightly less well known than Greg, and Altruistic is catching up still with Octopus. So maybe just by way of introduction to our company, I think we're sort of also in the startup space. We've grown similarly at a pretty radical pace. We're now 80 people worldwide, and for those who met us 2 years ago, we were maybe a quarter of that. I think my learning from this experience is that you sort of think about lots of small things done day after day in a consistent way, and a few big things that are bets. And let me maybe actually tie this in with what Greg was saying. So when Greg talked about Dong and Ørsted, one of the things that made the Dong transition to a sustainable business work from a heavy emitting business to a, let's say, purpose-driven renewable business was they bet the farm. Like at some point they said, actually, the business we're in isn't the business of the future. We need to pivot and do this new thing, and we're going to bet everything on this. And if it doesn't work, we're in serious trouble. But that's the bet we're making. And I think for us, for instance, we're in the sustainability data space, and we decided pretty early on, literally since day one, that we wanted to solve for decarbonization and impact reduction. We're not solving for reporting. If we solve for decarbonization and impact reduction well, then reporting is done as a byproduct. And that design choice meant that we tried to optimize for taking in data in large volumes, high granularity, assigning tags and classifications. It was a big engineering lift. And if we'd gone down the wrong path with that, if that had been the wrong bet, and actually it turns out no one cares about decarbonization, everyone just wants to fill out a GRI report, then actually this would be a massive hemorrhage of cash in the wrong thing. And so that's kind of what I think about as like a big strategic bet, and you need it to work out, but it's an act of conviction behind your purpose. If I maybe look in the other corner, and I think about what is it that you need to do repeatedly, day in after day, day in and day out, what I've noticed is, so the average age in our company is probably 29, 30, thereabouts. So we have generally a very young community. And this community has come to us primarily because they want to change the world. Like I think probably 60%, 50% of people at Altruistic are here because they genuinely want to change the world, and that's all they care about. And actually it's not about the money, it's not about share options, it's about changing the world. 25% want both, and 25%, let's be honest, are probably here for the money. You know who you are. But if you kind of think about that 75% base and what it takes to keep them energized and excited to come in day after day, you need to show that you're sincere and that it shows up in all the small things. So for instance, we're a business dedicated to transparency, right? We're making environmental data clear, accessible, transparent. And if we're not transparent with ourselves internally, and if we don't cascade bad news as fast as good, and if we're not upfront and honest with our customers, our business will call us out. And so every now and then, right, in all candor, every now and then, this is software, there's a bug, there's an issue, there's a problem. Every now and then a calculation goes fuzzy. And it's not just us, it's a figment of the space. But we realize that every day, every other day, we maybe need to make a hard choice and just go to a customer and say, look, this is something that's happened. We're going to fix it together. And that's how we work through this. And that's not just to build and maintain trust with our customer, but it's also to make sure that everyone in the team knows that we're sincere and committed. And as a retention strategy, that's the hard thing, I think. It's very easy to update the website. It's very easy to put, a mission statement out there. It's very hard every day to make a decision in line with a certain value, knowing that it may or may not always resonate and may or may not always feel like the right thing. One example is we had to create a commercial ethics policy, which is, for anyone who kind of is wondering what this means, it's like which customers will we not sell to? And for us, actually, this came up pretty early because we had people in our team who were challenging why we were in a tender process with a company doing A, B, or C. And so we had to basically define it. And the way we thought about it was we want to keep it simple and practical. So we said, look, if the person selling the contract or the person working on the contract would not be excited to find that this customer was 10 times more successful in their core business next year, we shouldn't be selling it. So now if you kind of apply that filter and you think about, let's say, a tobacco company, right? Would I be happy to wake up and find that a tobacco company had made 10 times more money? Probably not, right? There's a few other businesses where I can say the same thing. I worked with a company in the coal liquefaction space. Would I be happy if next year they did 10 times more revenue? Probably not. And so if that's the rule of thumb, then you shouldn't want to do business there because you won't be sincere and you won't want to give it your best. And those sorts of things, frankly, are okay in good times, and in bad times look much harder. But that's the tax you pay on consistency, I think. So I find that both the big strategic bets and the small day after day decisions end up being equally important.
And Greg, I can imagine you can relate to this as well, having the energy crisis and cost of living. There must have been quite a few big, hard decisions that you had to come up against where it could have gone, either way, but the mission aligned and perhaps not mission aligned. How do you manage those?
Yeah, I think you talk about the cost of living crisis. I mean, it was a gas crisis. It was a fossil fuel crisis. It was entirely caused because of our dependence as a society on fossil fuels. Obviously, I think we all know that the biggest component was Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sudden requirement for a lot of Western countries, a lot of European countries, to remove themselves from reliance on Russian gas. But actually, even before that, in the post-pandemic supply chain disruptions, gas was caught up with all the other things. And we've already seen a doubling of the price of gas before the invasion of Ukraine. I think I'm really quite proud of the UK government on this, actually, which was very early on. I remember going to see the Secretary for Energy at the time and saying, look, we need to be really clear. This isn't an energy crisis. It's a gas crisis. And the government covered it in that way. And I think it's really helpful for people to know that, for example, this wasn't caused because of the fact we've adopted renewables. In fact, if we'd adopted renewables faster and more fully, we'd have been better insulated against it. And I think we as a company, right at the beginning of the crisis, we actually changed all of our billboards. Say gas is expensive, wind is cheap, build more wind, right? Because we desperately need the policies to be able to build more wind. Now, the downside is, such is our addiction as a society to fossil fuels, instead of building more wind, for example, Germany built 5 liquid natural gas terminals. And I remember I was on a stage with a former energy minister, and she said, obviously the gas thing's very urgent. I'm like, well, fucking hell, forgive me language, sorry. But you can build a wind farm in a year if you just gave us permission, right? Mm. If we had permission, we could be building a wind farm in a year. And people go like, well, what difference that will make? But actually, for any decent sized town or village, we can build a wind farm nearby. We could generate, a huge chunk of their electricity and insulate them dramatically from the fossil fuel crisis. And sadly, certainly the UK, I think I saw a couple of days ago, there wasn't a single application to build a new wind farm last year in England. So I think on the one hand, I think the public really appreciated that this is a gas crisis. But what we haven't done is crystallize upon that understanding to take the action we need. That, look, we may be through the fossil fuel crisis for now, although let's remember that they happen periodically. They happen roughly once or twice every decade. And we haven't capitalized on that to deal with the bigger crisis of climate change by building more, for example, wind farms. There is some good news. We work across, I think we generate electricity in 15 countries now. And in some countries, it is now easier and faster than it's ever been. In Spain, there's a regime where in parts of Spain, we can get permission to build a wind farm in 10 days, right? It's incredible, right? And so what we're beginning to do is build this checkerboard of country and policy. And then you fill it out and you say, right, which countries are delivering policies? And then we can take the best of that and take it to every country to enable us to deploy faster. And so I think now we are going to see a race. Incredibly, I mean, it wasn't to be a question, so forgive me for going off piece, but look, the world at the moment is full of, I think, in some ways, unnecessary divisions, and we're ending up kind of dividing more than we ever need. But half of all the renewables in the world built last year were built in and by China. If you look at the growth rate of, for example, Chinese electric car companies, while Western car companies are struggling to deliver competitive electric vehicles and therefore are saying electric vehicles are not popular, they don't work, whatever, China's just gone all in and on both renewable generation and the uses of renewables, electric vehicles and heat pumps. I think a lot of Western countries are about to see an absolute tidal wave of change. And we should either be grabbing that and benefiting both our citizens and the planet, or we're just going to find that we're left behind, increasingly irrelevant.
Yeah, I think we're actually seeing a similar thing happen in emerging markets, which is quite interesting, where if you look at certain value chains, and let's take textiles as an example, some countries are leaning in much more and much further on decarbonization, and they're doing it at a national level and a strategic level. And as a result, their industries are going to be better positioned to benefit as brands start switching around their supply chains. And I think that's kind of when you sort of say the 10 days to build a wind farm, like, you know, again, I grew up in Pakistan, and I know Pakistan this is nowhere on the roadmap. Like, it will not take 10 days. It may take 10 years, and you're lucky to get paid at the end of that. And, you know, like, Pakistan has a big textile industry. And I think that they should be looking at Bangladesh and looking at Vietnam and looking at Thailand and starting to see how some of this policy is just going to radically reframe competitiveness. And I actually think for those in the room buying from like agricultural value chains, this is just going to be heavier, right? Like, we're looking at, you know, Africa, LATAM, Asia. There's going to be big implications for global trade flows as a result of some, you know, I mean, your policy grid almost is a good guideline for a lot of companies to look at and kind of wonder if they'll be competitive just by virtue of what their government is doing or not doing.
We should work on it together. I think there's, like, just to put this in perspective, in parts of the global south, you can generate electricity from solar energy at under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Currently, a consumer in the UK, by the way, is paying 37 cents per kilowatt hour. With fossil fuels, the cheapest we can get to is maybe 5 or 6 cents. So renewables can be 3 times cheaper than the cheapest alternatives. And that's only getting better. I think the cost of solar fell by about 40% over the last 2 years. Right? All these technologies really mean, for a long time, a lot of people working in sustainability have had to struggle with saying, how do you tell your company or your supply chain they have to spend more to tick some boxes? Honestly, increasingly throughout the world now, we're at the tipping point where the fundamentals, the physics of certainly in energy, of clean energy, are cheaper than the alternative. And finding ways to enable supply chains and companies to benefit from that, even before markets have caught up, is a huge opportunity. And I think, by the way, 2024 is the pivotal year for it.
And I think also before regulation is caught up. Like, again, you know, I remember looking at the cost of electricity in this Pakistan textile context, and the mainstream cost was about 20 cents per unit. The subsidized agriculture rate was about 7, and the solar kind of and battery stack was 4, basically. So you actually had, just on a mainstream basis, renewable energy cheaper than even the subsidized agricultural rate. And I think that's actually probably the case in a lot of global south.
And so you mentioned you work across 15 countries. How do you actually tailor, or do you tailor that narrative, that mission in each context?
I think, I started off by talking about the fundamentals, but according to someone I spoke to, the laws of physics are literally the same everywhere in the world. And so it's really helpful to talk to governments and regulators and business partners about the laws of physics. Because the laws of physics really, really, really apply in the world of, for example, electricity. So the first thing is that solar power and renewables, if you've got and wind and hydro, as long as you've got the right resources available, most countries have got at least one of those 3, are increasingly cheaper than anything else. And then talking to governments about the fact that well, it turns out humans are pretty much the same everywhere in the world as well. It's really easy to fall for this thing that people are different. But honestly, the fundamentals for everyone, everyone wants cheap power, right? By the way, there are 600 million people in developing countries that don't have any power at all, right? And you know, incredibly, they are often in regions that got, for example, a lot of sunshine, often a lot of wind as well. Instead of big, expensive grid-based projects, we can be bypassing those huge infrastructures to go straight to the kind of thing that Seth was talking about, which is locally generated solar plus battery maybe, plus wind maybe, cheaper than power has ever been. And very similarly to the way in which smartphones leapfrog the need for landline infrastructure. And so ultimately, I think wherever we're talking the world, it's really about the fundamentals that citizens and businesses, industries, want access to cheap power, and the cheapest power is from renewables. And then we just have to talk about, within a given context, what the best way of delivering that is.
Mm. And Seth, would you say the same for the traditional sustainability data challenges, speaking to the sustainability practitioners in the room?
Yeah, I think, Izzy, like I'm seeing sort of three paradigms globally. One is, let's say, the EU reporting paradigm. And so you have a lot of regulation that's come in, and just from companies that we speak with, that's driving a need to report. And so most large companies around the world are captured by that, either because they're in the EU, or they're exporting into the EU, or they have a division, et cetera. And I think that's one thing driving change. I think there's a second paradigm, which I see as the let's create a new industry globally kind of paradigm. And I sort of put the US and China, and to an extent India, in that bucket, where I think the US and China and India are all indicating a desire to create large-scale industrial advantage through a very proactive muscular industrial policy. Inflation Reduction Act, great example in the US. China going down that route already. Look at the mobility value chain. India on grid power, right? Clearly heading in that direction as well. And I think that pretty much these three, I think, are going to really reshape how a lot of this works. And I think the third paradigm is countries that don't have the financial muscle or firepower to go in that second camp, and don't necessarily have the consumer demand to fall in that first camp, but want to be competitive and want to make sure that they can emerge, maybe not as net, like, they don't win a huge share of the pie, but they can at least win versus their traditional competitors. And so I think about countries like Costa Rica, for instance, where we've just made our first hires. And for Costa Rica, they're looking at how do they have a net zero export policy, where actually everything that they export can be a net zero product. And I think that's quite interesting. And you'll see, I think, a number of countries start to try and play in that direction, where they look at a specific value chain and they want to take a part of that value chain and they want to just sort of win versus their traditional competitors in that space. I think those three sort of paradigms are what I see shaping a lot of thinking. And so in the EU, for instance, a lot of the conversation we have is still around just reporting and kind of filling out data and kind of getting stuff over the line. In the US, a lot of it is now shifting over to how do you benefit from subsidy regimes. The sheer scale of funding available is huge. I expect to see the same thing in China, maybe a year behind, 2 years behind with new regulation now coming in. I expect to see the same thing and maybe a year or two behind that in India. And then on the other stuff, I think it's very specific to particular materials. So like I think Bangladesh is moving on garments and textiles. I think Costa Rica and certain LATAM countries will move on fruit, for instance, and a lot of agricultural produce. I think it's going to be quite interesting to watch how just global trade is reshaped as a result of this.
And I'd love to draw on also what innovations are going to help shape this. Greg, what do you think, first and foremost as a tech entrepreneur, what do you think are the big technologies that are going to shape the energy transition in particular?
I mean, one thing is we have all the technology we need today, right? So you'll see a lot of the time people want to delay the transition. We'll talk about expensive things like carbon capture and storage, or hydrogen for heating, or nuclear fusion. And they may or may not, any of them, be any use at all. But we don't need them. Today, through renewables, and maybe a small amount of gas backup, but honestly, that may turn out to be even that may be necessary. We can provide the power needs of the world at lower cost than we experience today. For those parts of the world that don't immediately have access to lots of renewables, long distance interconnectors. Our company's backing a project to build a connector from Morocco to the UK, with a huge solar farm and wind farm in Morocco. Long distance interconnectors, for example, are becoming the way in which power is moved around in China, and they'll become kind of more and more standard globally. The point being, we don't need any new technology. If we get it, it's just a bonus. forgive me for an outdated metaphor, but the iPhone launched with Edge, if anyone remembers.
Yeah.
And if you got an Edge signal today, honestly, you'd just give up and send a letter, right? But that was enough to get going. And then we got 3G and 4G and 5G, and 6 is on the way. And in the same way, we just get going with what we've got. And so the single thing we really need is just to electrify everything we can. Electricity, which is not a massive new innovation, just turns out to be remarkable. An electric car turns 80% of the power of a battery into motion. A petrol car turns 25% of the energy in the petrol into motion. A gas boiler turns 85% of the energy in the gas into heat. A heat pump turns 300% to 500%, but generates 3 to 5 times more heat than the energy input. By that, it doesn't break the laws of physics. We can talk about that. Electricity is just better, but it's also fungible. If you've got a house with solar panels and a battery and a heat pump, we can guarantee no energy bills because we can grab energy from the electricity from the grid when we need it. We can dump it back onto the grid, get paid for it, and then balance the whole thing. You can't do any of this with fossil fuels. And so I think the single thing is electrification. As you electrify, it might be that today electricity is generated by a gas power station or even coal. But if the end use is electrified, bit by bit, we can replace that with renewables. And again, incredibly, thanks to the efficiency of electricity, an electric car, which gets all of its electricity from a gas power station, will generate less emissions than a petrol car. An electric heat pump that gets all of its electricity from a gas power station will generate less emissions than a gas boiler. Right? So electrification is the only thing we need to think about. All the rest will then follow.
And Seth, what are your big bets for the decarbonisation transition?
I'm going to mostly agree with Greg. Smart bet, I think. But I'm going to add 4 other things. So I would say the first one I agree is basically, I think, a shift to renewables. I think a shift to renewables in different formats, however you cut it, whether it's solar, whether it's distributed, whether it's centralized, whether it's wind. I think there's a shift to that. And I think storage within that is going to be a big component as well. If I look at it from the perspective of, certainly most of the companies in the room with us and many listening online, and I sort of look at it from the perspective of your climate roadmap, your carbon baseline, what is actually going to move the needle, I think that most companies I speak with are looking at 5 buckets, basically. The first one is the shift to renewables. In the context of, again, your carbon numbers, that's a very small thing for most companies. It's 1%, 2%, 3%, just in how this stuff is calculated. I think there's a second lever, which is electrification of transport. And I think it flows from the first almost, where, I can if you electrify transport in China today, it's probably like a nuclear explosion for the environment because you get a lot of coal-based power. So you need to kind of decarbonize grids and then actually have electrification of transport. The third situation, I think, is around circularity, and I would specifically look at packaging for that. I'm using circularity broadly, and I'm kind of seeing recycled content, as well as, let's say, reuse and other modes, because anything you can do to kind of reduce the new material use in that, I think, is going to be important. The fourth thing that we're seeing a lot of is alternative materials. And so think about whether it's like meat-based materials switching to plant-based, in many cases, whether it's natural switching to synthetic, which can often actually be lower emissions as well. I think there's a lot of material switches. That's an exciting space for innovation. I think exciting for entrepreneurship. Lots of money, I think, will flow into that. But also it's just, it's an area which is quite complex because you need to, I was speaking with the COO of a big food company recently, and what he was telling me was that they struggled to get enough capacity on the production side that it made sense for them because they wanted to buy a dairy alternative at huge scale, and the supplier was able to supply 1% of what they would have wanted. So they now need to somehow pool together, other suppliers and make that work. And I think that can be tricky. And then the fifth thing I would look at is agriculture-oriented reductions. I don't use regenerative agriculture because I think that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think there are parts of that work particularly well for emissions reduction and parts that maybe don't. But I think about any agricultural-related sequestration, et cetera, as another big tool in the toolbox that most companies I speak with are looking at. So those 5, I would say, from a company backwards lens.
I feel a bit mean.
I would. Let me just jump in. No, so and by the way, I counted it. You said 4, and then you did 5 as one of your 4, which I think is 9. Right? But I think it's entirely reasonable. It's extremely compelling. But obviously, I'm seated in the wheelhouse of energy. And I think the one observation I would add there on top of this electrification thing is that end use changes when you change the source. So, for example, renewables are the cheapest form of electricity, energy we've ever had, and get cheaper every year, as long as you use them at the time they're being generated. And I think getting used to the idea that, for example, traditionally it might have been most efficient to, run a factory for a straight 16 hours. We might get to a world where sometimes it's most cost efficient to shift production depending on the cheapness of electricity at different times. And, a great example here in the UK is we've got a product called Intelligent Octopus. If you've got an electric car, you get home, you plug it in, and we automatically charge it at the cheapest times. So as long as, when you first sign up, you'll set your preference, 80% charge at 7 a.m. every day. And then within that, we just optimize, because you don't care whether we're charging at 5 p.m. or 5 a.m., as long as you get your preferences met. But that product means that the electricity is more than 3 times cheaper than standard grid price. It means that you can drive your car £2.30 for 100 miles, whereas with petrol, it's £20 for 100 miles. It's 8 times cheaper than driving on petrol, because we're optimizing it against the renewables. And I think, and by the way, the scale of this is incredible. Like a year ago, we had about 0.1 gigawatts of it, and it's now about 1 gigawatt. So it's grown about 10x in 1 year. Electric cars are only about 5% of the fleet, and only a quarter of them are on this product in the UK. Now, a gigawatt is the same as a nuclear power station. So when you see in the media all the time about how difficult it is to build a nuclear power station, right? In 1 year, we brought, a small one, by the way, it'll be a big one by the end of the year. But in a year or two, we created a nuclear power station's worth of electric vehicle flex. And as electric vehicles go from 5% the fleet to 100%, and as all of the cars end up on these kind of products, it's the equivalent of our entire electricity system today becomes flexible. And that flexibility, I think, really matters in the world of industry. So at the moment, there's a 10-year moratorium on building data centers to the west of London. Slough is the biggest concentration of data centers in Europe, and you can't build any more because you can't get the power. Meanwhile, in Scotland, we spent £3 billion last year throwing away green electricity because there wasn't any demand. And of course, what we should be doing is the data center should be moving to Scotland. And at the moment, the market signal's not there. Someone asked me earlier about what the biggest barriers for us are. It's the regulation of markets that open up the economics to incentivize companies to locate to where you've got cheap green power. But in the way that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, steelworks moved to where you had a lot of coal and a lot of iron ore. So we'll see a lot of energy-intensive industries moving to where you've got cheap electricity, and that'll be where it's windy and where it's sunny. Now we need the markets to open up, but I think this kind of electrification is not about saying it's business as usual and we just change the source of power. It's fundamentally, if I was looking after a supply chain, I'd be thinking about where can we start relocating stuff that will get this cheap power.
Yeah. I've been given the nod that we're out of time, but
that was Seth's 9 things.
Yeah, I know. All to blame. But I'd love to just ask both of you one last thing. If you had one piece of advice to give people or professionals who are trying to drive their mission, what would it be? Who wants to jump in first?
Great. I mean, first of all, obviously you've got far more info on this, but I think the biggest insight for us that's been successful is how do we align economic interests with planetary interests, the planet's interests. Because I think in doing so, we're not pushing water uphill, we're at least kind of following it downhill. And I think, if you look at the growth of the company, a huge part of it has come from, always seeking the combined win. And by it's not profit maximization, it's just economic viability or economic improvement alongside the planet. An interesting thing, by the way, Seth, you talked about the importance of what this means for teams. If I tell everyone here that last year we recruited 1,000 or 2,000 people and we're only an 8-year-old business. That's a big number. But how many job applications do you think we got? And any guesses? 1,000 or 2,000 jobs, right? If I said it was 260,000, right? So far this year, it's February the 19th-ish. I don't know, checked. We've had 80,000 job applications so far this year. People tell me you can't recruit tech people. We had 60,000 applications for software developers last year. Now, I just say this because, the extent to which aligning interests creates truly compelling opportunities for people. And look, if we get 250,000 job applications, and there's one in the room, so I'm very conscious of one. You've got this, like, you can pick the very best talent in the world. And that gives you this astonishing ability to outcompete incumbents. And so I guess the big thing for me is just thinking about this alignment of interests all the time.
Yeah, it's a good one. Seth?
I think for me, kind of related to that, I would just think about how brand benefits compound. And so actually, if you think about some of the most sustainable brands in the world, like Patagonia, for instance, right? And I saw a couple of people in the room wearing Patagonia. If you just think about the additional value that you get just by putting that logo on an item of clothing, I think that's the quantifiable benefit of building an enduring brand. And I think what most companies miss around sustainability is they think of it as a reporting challenge or something defined by the moment. Whereas actually, when I look at the data, I think about a generational transition of preferences. And I kind of look at, like, who is it in all those surveys that we talk about that is actually saying that they prefer the more sustainable option? It tends to be people who are younger. So actually, the biggest correlation is not income. And I actually did the analysis across different countries. It's actually age. Younger people tend to assign a higher priority to it across all countries, actually, like Indonesia, Malaysia, US, Japan, wherever you go. The second is they tend to be more urban. The third is that they tend to actually are less likely to identify as men. And actually, when you start looking at all the sort of dynamics of this buyer group, you get a really enduring, really loyal buyer group that also has many years of buying capacity ahead of them. And I think when you start to realize that that's the value play here, that's what you're playing for, then you want to really focus on building a sustainable brand that can actually survive for decades and just tap into, again, that new generation. And actually, again, the data tells us that the children of this generation are more likely to have even stronger preferences. Like the trend is actually generational, going back in time as well. So that the main thing I would think of is, like, how do you just create a brand that can last using sustainability as a springboard to do that better?
I think that's a great place to stop. I'm going to close down the live version. Thank you everyone online for joining, and open up questions